If you were to ask any fellow movie fan about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, there are several responses you're guaranteed to receive. Whatever you've heard, there's no doubt that The Shining is one of the most iconic films in the horror genre and possibly of all time. But what you may not have heard is that in order to get there, Stanley Kubrick had to make some major changes to King's material to suit the movie. Or did he? Today I want to discuss the role of a writer in a movie's film production, how the tale of two artists who saw the same story vastly differently resulted in a debate that will last till the end of time, and what we can learn from both Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Writing is a skill that I'm most passionate about. The idea that one person can put pen to paper and create an entire world of characters, worlds, concepts, plots, emotion, and everything in between, all from their mind, is the best superpower I could ever ask for. Ever feel bored with the world around you? Create your own. Want to offer a new perspective on a concept? Write it down. Feel like pouring your heart and soul into a manuscript and finally showing the world who you really are through your art? You have at it. There was an article in The Atlantic that basically reconfirmed why I stopped writing scripts and moved on to novels. I've linked it below. The essential message that it pursues is that Hollywood is built off showmanship, and how it got there was through exploiting what somebody else had created. And when you really think about it, this is also quite common with the book publishing industry. Whilst you may have poured your heart and soul into a particular story, unless your name is J.K. Rowling, and especially if you're a debut writer, you likely won't get much control over how that is marketed. Hell, even J.K. Rowling didn't when she first started out. Hollywood and the publishing industry has the common goal of making money, and to an outsider like me and the rest of us, this is obvious, but you know in your head that your script is going to sell millions and change the world and be analyzed to death by losers like me on the internet. If the publishing company wants to, they will decide what the best kind of cover is, what the best kind of font is, and sometimes even certain story elements. That last one is becoming rarer in the publishing industry, but it's nowhere near the amount of times that a screenplay will be changed. Whereas in the book industry, an editor works with the author to help them realize the best way to tell their story and aims to improve it, working on a screenplay is vastly different. A screenplay is ultimately a blueprint, and thus will change multiple times during production due to changes in anything from vision, a certain location not being available, actors ad-libbing certain lines, alternate takes, anything. Whilst being riveting to read is what will often get a screenplay picked up by producers, it isn't the same thing as writing a manuscript and selling it to be read through a publishing house. Stanley Kubrick was even quoted as saying, "A script isn't meant to be read. It's meant to be realized on film." And unless your name is Michael Tucker, I doubt you would meet many people who read scripts as often as you would read books, and in there is kind of the problem. So let's talk about Stephen King's The Shining. Even if you're not a horror fan, you know who Stephen King is, or you've at least heard of his work. He's one of those writers that will take a concept so ridiculous and still find a way to make it engaging and frightening for the audience. For me, he exists in a perfect realm of writing that's just accessible enough that it draws me in each time, and extremely creative enough to linger in my mind long after I've read one of his books. This is a man who managed to make a sentient car, a crazed fangirl, and a clown that hangs out in the sewers of Derry pure terrifying. The Shining is one of his most honest works, since it came at a time when King was working through his own troubles through his writing. This involved his addiction, his depression, and his inability to think that he would be able to write again, a feeling that all writers are far too familiar with, although hopefully not to the same extent. As a result, King put a lot of his own feelings and experiences into creating the novel's main character, Jack Torrance, a man who, like him, was a struggling writer at the time who moves to the Overlook Hotel with his family as a way to start over and get his life back on track. Throughout the rest of the novel, Jack Torrance constantly struggles with his own inner demons and tries his hardest to reconcile with his family despite ultimately becoming possessed by the souls haunting the Overlook Hotel. In an attempt to get Jack to kill his wife and son and therefore inherit his shining power, the ghostly presence of the Overlook possesses him and starts using him as a puppet to enact this, much like an expression of how your inner demons can begin controlling you if you don't gain control over them. In a desperate attempt, eventually his family manage to overcome him, and Jack dies tragically as he sacrifices his own life, blowing up the hotel, allowing his family and the Overlook's cook, Halloran, to escape with their lives. Whilst it's not exactly a happy ending, it does have a ray of light among the darkness that plagues the entire entire story. A very captivating read in my opinion, and one that you should definitely check out if you've only ever seen the film. King clearly put more of his effort into using the fantasy of ghosts to tell a realistic story about a struggling father trying his best to reconcile with his family. Jack was quite a tragic character, and it doesn't take much to realize that King was effectively trying to help himself out of his own troubles through writing this character. He managed to blend his own imaginative talent as a writer in order to create a truly terrifying Shakespearean tragedy. The success of this book was likely what inspired him to keep going, and if it hadn't, we may have missed out on stories like The Dark Tower, Pet Sematary, It, Misery, Christine, Cujo, Gerald's Game, and so much more of his work. As a writer, you would naturally be proud of that, and to see that you managed to turn your own troubles into something that people still connect with and gravitate towards even today is a true testament to his talent as a writer. And even on paper, The Shining seems like it would make a terrific movie. However, now we move on to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Just before you switch this video off and type in the comments that I hand over my film fan badge and delete my account and shut up, I just want to make it clear that I do not hate Stanley Kubrick's The Shining despite my love for the source material. However, I'm sure it's even a controversial statement to say that I hate the attitude that brought it into existence, and even my editor is likely shaking his head in disapproval at me right now. But I would be an absolute idiot to say that this is a flat out bad film, because it's not. In fact, I would say it's a bloody great one. It's tense, creepy, paced really well, has great performances, a haunting score, is shot beautifully, and is endlessly rewatchable. However, often in adaptations, it's always the big changes that readers will notice, is Harry Potter was American instead of British, or if Peter Pan was actually a sexist prat, you know what, never mind. The point is, people would notice those things right from the start, but in The Shining, it's all the little changes that end up having the biggest impact on why this film, despite its greatness, always leaves a bad taste in my mouth. My major problem with Kubrick's The Shining is the difference in tone. Whereas the book was a fascinating ghost story about a man who was trying his best to do well by his family, Kubrick's version of Jack Torrance is a dick to his family, almost all the way through. There's one scene where he does try and connect with Danny and almost does the same with Wendy, but for a large part of his screen time, it's Jack Nicholson scowling, talking to himself, and throwing things around. In the finale, he shows almost no remorse for what he's doing, whereas the tragedy of that moment in the book was that Jack was trying to stop himself from being controlled, and he was simply powerless. Whereas in the movie, what happened to Jack was still tragic, but Jack Nicholson can't help but play overbearingly creepy and terrifying. But he has none of Jack's heart from the book. Ultimately, whereas the book's ending was tragic with a bitter sweetness, Kubrick's ending feels a lot more nihilistic, and seeing as King put a lot of himself into Jack Torrance, you could see why he views this adaptation as something that attacks him. Wait, you probably heard this before, believe me, I know. Anytime I get into a conversation about The Shining, this always comes up, and I'm always told the same thing. Okay, I realize I have very strong opinions about how this was adapted, but I can't help it. However, I know we're not going to learn anything from simply getting mad over how it was adapted. The truth is, it happened. It exists, and it's a great movie. But here's why I think this movie is so different, yet so familiar, but so incredibly Kubrick. It's worth noting that Jack is a struggling writer in both versions of the story, and to me it feels like Kubrick and King both have different ideas on how they view the art of writing. King is interested in the struggle and put a lot of his own journey into the writing process. Kubrick is interested in the struggle and put a lot of his own journey into the writing process. Whilst that is ultimately the same thing, the difference is perspective. And in writing, perspective is everything. Look, we all know it. Stanley Kubrick is a bit of a perfectionist and a strong, passionate personality. You could almost argue his take on Jack represents how he feels when the people around him are distracting him whilst he's trying to make something great, because none of us know what it's like to be in Stanley Kubrick's head, but King is also a perfectionist in his own way, and it's because of their passion, it's obvious to me that King and Kubrick couldn't be further from each other in terms of their storytelling abilities. Like King said, the book ended in fire, whereas the movie ended in ice. Look, I'll be honest with you guys, I'm always going to prefer Stephen King's The Shining over Stanley Kubrick's. There's nothing you can say to make me change that, and there's nothing I can say to convert Kubrick fans into King fans, and so forth and so forth. But really, why should they? We all have different tastes. we all have different perspectives. If you try and stick cheese down a lactose intolerant person's mouth, it's not going to make them like it anymore. There is no reason that I cannot appreciate both of these for what they do. The truth is, I know if I put years of struggle into a narrative that helped heal me and someone took that and twisted it into something different, I would be pretty upset too. I'm a writer, it's who I am. But part of loving something is knowing when to let go, and being a writer in this industry always means being open to change. I am a big advocate for not policing writers on their creativity and telling them what they can and can't write. So I can't hate Kubrick's The Shining in spite of King. That would make me a hypocrite. This show is called Stories as Lessons, so I want you to walk away with learning something. So here goes. Stop treating writers like puppets. A writer's job on Star Wars is not to give you all the fan service you feel you deserve. When you go around saying the book doesn't matter because the movie was so great, you're essentially telling a writer that their contribution to the work was inconsequential, which is ridiculous, as if they hadn't written the source, the movie would not exist. I do not want the beauty of being a writer to become another tool in the process. As a writer, you have infinite potential. A director's job can be to realize that potential and maybe even improve on it, but when it's a great collaborative effort, it's the best of both worlds. So pay attention to writers, and I'm not just talking Charlie Kaufman or Aaron Sorkin. There is an infinite world of original stories in bookstores that release monthly, weekly, daily, even in your local library. I urge you, go inside one. Find something that appeals to you and lose yourself in the world. If you want to be a good writer or even director, it helps a lot if you read a lot. And not just scripts, read fiction, examine the art that goes into it. Don't just treat it like a part of the process, but a process in and of itself. For this reason, I gravitate towards directors who also write their own movies. Edgar Wright, Greta Gerwig, Jordan Peele, Kelly Freeman Craig, Guillermo del Toro, Richard Linklater, James Gunn, Quentin Tarantino, Christopher Nolan, Spike Jonze, the Coen brothers, and last but not least, Stanley Kubrick. Whilst I will always have a bit of a distaste for how he essentially took the Stephen King story and refused to collaborate with him on the film, I can't hate the fact that what Kubrick essentially did was make his own interpretation of the ideas The Shining inspired him with. We'll probably never get an as well-made and terrifying film version of this story, and that's not ideal, but that's also what being a writer is. Writing in any industry is all about collaboration. It's about ambition, wanting to say something with your art, having that art mean something different to millions of people and maybe even inspire them. If we want to keep getting these great stories that speak to the human condition in an entertaining way, we need to do just one thing. So I'll leave you with this. Dear Hollywood, cinephiles, bibliophiles, and everyone else, if we want great stories to keep happening, then we need to stop killing our writers.